Let me welcome you all to the second O.P. Jindal lecture by Professor Uday Singh Mehta. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia here at Brown at its Watson Institute and Professor of Political Science. The Jindal lectures, O.P. Jindal lectures, O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures, were endowed in perpetuity by Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown parents, in the memory of Sajjan's father, O.P. Jindal, for a discussion every semester by a distinguished intellectual of a discussion of politics, economics, and cultural and social change in modern India. We've had 10 such lectures. It's been going on for 10 years, and it's a very important intellectual event every semester for us at the center. Uday Singh Mehta is a distinguished professor of political science at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, based in the city of New York. His work encompasses a wide spectrum of philosophical traditions and issues, including the relationship between freedom and imagination, liberalism's complex links with colonialism and empire, and more recently, and this lecture belongs to this third body of work, war, peace, and nonviolence. His first book was The Anxiety of Freedom, Imagination and Individuality in the Political Thought of John Locke. His second, an eye-opening book for me personally, was entitled Liberalism and Empire, 19th Century British Liberal Thought, which won the J. David Greenstone Award from the American Political Science Association in 2002 for the best book in history and theory. Uday received his undergraduate education at Swarthmore College, where he majored in mathematics and philosophy, and then got a PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. After that, he's taught at Princeton, Cornell, MIT, University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, University of Hull in the UK, Amherst College, and since the fall of 2010 at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. In the first lecture, Uday made three claims which could be summarized as follows. First, Gandhi's conception of democracy was non-Schumpeterian or non-J.S. Mill, if you will. He was not particularly fond of a conception of democracy that heavily relied on elections, representation, individual rights, freedom, etc. And he favored a view of democracy which concentrated on the following formulation. All human beings, including the poorest and the most deprived, had potentialities that could be cultivated to confront and transcend power, authority, order, security. So this is about potentialities that each of us has and each of us can cultivate further, regardless of our background. The second claim was about the overwhelming importance of the quotidian and the routine. To quote him, Gandhi was never drawn to the dream of a new kind of society or a new kind of man, Rather, for him, the transcendental was nested into the routines of the everyday. End of quote. And the third claim was about lack of consequentialism and overwhelming importance of courage. To quote again, willingness to die in the face of a morally obnoxious power was the basis for living a morally meaningful, full life, according to Gandhi. End of quote. The first lecture was entitled Critiquing Empire and the Challenge of Representation. And the second lecture to be delivered today is entitled Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality. We have two superb commentators, Karuna Mantena and Juliet Hooker. I will introduce them after the lecture is over. Both, each will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes as a way of commenting on Uday's lecture. So Uday will speak for 45 minutes, and then we will turn to the discussants. Uday, welcome to Brown once again.
Thank you, Ashu. As I said last time, it's a pleasure to be here and to speak to all of you. Many of you are not even in America, but so in any case, I want to thank you. Ashu just gave the title of my talk, so I'm not going to repeat him. So towards the beginning of his autobiography, Gandhi says, quote, "What I've been striving and pining for these past 30 years is self-realization, to see God face to face, to attain moksha. I live and move and have my being in pursuit of this goal. All that I do by way of speaking, writing, all my ventures in the political field are directed at this same end." End of quote. The reason I start with this passage is because Gandhi explicitly links his political works to a spiritual goal. If one asks what makes the goal spiritual, the answer is that it is spurred by a desire for self-realization, which Gandhi elaborated in terms of, quote, "seeing God face to face to attain moksha," end of quote. The passage goes on to claim that some things we do are known only to, this is a quote, "only to oneself and one's maker. These are clearly incommunicable," end of quote. In contrast, the experiments that his autobiography deals with are, quote, "spiritual and moral," end of quote. Then he concludes the paragraph with the injunction, quote, "for the essence of religion is morality," end of quote. Gandhi has been associated with the major political events of the 20th century: decolonization, the fight against racial apartheid, the critique of war and violence, a critique of consumerism, a skepticism regarding the role of technology, and more generally, bringing the common man and women into the fold of public life. These associations have naturally engendered the view that he was in the main a political thinker, not simply that he had not simply that that his thought had political implications, but that he thought in political terms, that his ideal was somehow itself political. What is definitive of modern politics, as I said in my previous lecture, is that it gives priority to self-preservation, self-protection and self-preservation, sovereignty, order, and to power. And in its liberal variant, to chastening power through the state and constitutional restraints. It does this because it is responding to a distinctly modern detritus, for which there is only a political solution. The problems and the solutions are hence, in some specific way, political. They take the context as defined and constrained by an underlying fact, expressed in the Latin maxim salus populi suprema lex esto, where salus no longer referred to salvation, but to safety. Gandhi does something altogether different. His radical idealism stems from the connection that he establishes between self-knowledge, seeing God face to face, and his public endeavors, all of which he identifies with the spiritual. It is telling that he makes no reference to the narrative and the grammar of modern political power and politics. He does so at least in part because he did not share the trauma that underlay modern politics. These specific concerns acquired their salience, at least in the English tradition, because they were seen as having a deep link with the Civil War, which itself was seen as culminating in the paradigmatic case of anarchy. Hobbes makes safety the condition for society, rather than the reverse. The complex weave of society, the condition for security. The point is that in the rationality of modern political thought, and to a substantial extent in modern political practice, conflict and even uncertainty precipitate an image of falling off a cliff or a precipice that culminates in anarchy and death. The social is defunct, having lost its historical capacity to offer any resistance and an alternative model to the political. The family, religious communities, friendships, the conventions and practices of social clubs, individual self-discipline, in brief, the conviviality and conflict that mark everyday practices with their ethical density cannot retard or let alone alleviate the fall into desolation and anarchy. Political power is always responding, typically as an anxious anticipation to a kind of brutality, with its limiting case being death. The hegemony of politics is now complete. In fact, it has been implicit ever since Hobbes declared that the central fact that was implicit in modern life was insecurity and fear. Hobbes' response to this predicament was to make clear the conditions for security, articulating them through the Leviathan and more generally, the redemptive power of politics. So security is the central catechism of contemporary secular lives. It is not merely that a concern with security has been the authorizing warrant for the perpetual motion of recent foreign wars, or that security and not ideology in its traditional sense now underwrite a global vision that needs the buttress of far-flung garrisons. At one level, this capacious agenda of action testifies to the new ways in which everything is connected, to the fact that the designation of separate spheres on which modern liberalism relied and on whose denial totalitarianism prospered are increasingly tenuous distinctions. It is now a familiar fact that officials routinely justify even the most mundane aspects of public policy by invoking the idea of security. Implicit in this conception of political rationality is a normalization of a heightened regard for security, both individual and collective, a concern with unity because it increases the prospect of clear identities and hence security, an emphasis on the norms such as toleration, because they are deemed to be essential to coexistence, especially under conditions characterized by diversity. A devaluation of individual courage, because it always, or almost always, puts at risk self-preservation. A high valuation of technology, because it is typically tied with corporeal needs such as health and corporeal well-being. Finally, and in general, this rationality is associated with the progressive energy of the state, because it alone has the power to secure the things I have mentioned above. This political rationality finds expression in many things that characterize modern civilization, most conspicuously in the idea that the state is the ultimate guarantor of order, because it alone can claim to be sovereign. All other forms of order are reliant on this guarantee. This is another way of saying that the social is defunct. Whatever order it does supply is illusionary, that ultimately it cannot be relied on without an implicit or sometimes explicit reliance on the guarantees offered by the state. Through a chain of nested dependencies, the state underwrote all relations of power and authority. Nothing could be wholly independent of what it offers. It is like a building in which all the floors, despite their apparent solidity, are in fact dependent on the solidity of the foundations of the building. This vision is in sharp contrast with that of Gandhi. He did not give either individual or collective security any priority. He did not privilege borders, identity, unity, or the nation for that matter. Rather, he thought in civilizational terms. He did not think that toleration had to be valued as an independent thing, which required the vigilance and mediation of the state. As I said on Wednesday, he did place a high value on individual courage, because it indicated a readiness for freedom and maturity. He was suspicious of technology because it facilitated a kind of vicarious existence. That is, it gave an inducement to be and to live good other than who one really was. In brief, he was opposed and suspicious of the sort of mediation and reliance on power, especially the power of the state and its institutions. Gandhi valued the social in its various forms: the family, religion, the face-to-face practices, depth, slowness, and patience, because in his view, these were the grounds through which self-realization could be achieved. In brief, these were the constituent parts of his spiritual vision. This had profound and significant implications, because if one embeds the familiar pieces of his thought and practice, they assume a wholly different meaning in this frame, with the spiritual and not the political at its center. He did not rely on rationality that put the political at its center, because he was not drawn to its motivating assumption, namely the absence of power and of the state, that the absence of power of the state we would have a condition of utter desolation and anarchy. Even anarchy did not in the end trouble him so much. When Gandhi was desperate to avoid partition and the British were claiming that the imperial presence alone was the condition for retaining the unity of India, he said, quote, "Leave us to our anarchy," end of quote. For the rest of this paper, I will draw out some of the implications of the constituent parts of this alternative framing. It is alternative because it puts the social and not the political at the center of his thought, which in turn is deeply attentive to the needs of the self. I will focus first on the idea of toleration, second, courage, third, patience, and finally, religion. Finally, fourth, religion. I should say at the outset, because in my view, all these are part of a general claim of achieving self-realization, seeing God face to face, moksha, in brief, of achieving a spiritual goal, they each make basically the same general point, and therefore there is going to be considerable repetition. Let me go on to say something about toleration. Gandhi was not opposed to toleration. He just did not think it had to be underwritten by the institutions of the state, which ultimately relied on its overwhelming power. In fact, he thought toleration was part of the long-established civilizational inheritance of South Asia. Toleration, therefore, did not require the special support or protections of doctrines and institutions associated with secularism. For Gandhi, religious diversity and a basic unity of coexistence, underwritten by civilizational rhythms and not unitary power, are simply facts. They are part of the warmth and weft of an ancient land, and for him, they provoked none of the anxiety that they do in the modern political tradition. Or, as he says in Hind Swaraj, to his nationalist interlocutor, they are merely facts, banal and scattered in their obvious familiarity. Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi points out, have survived and prospered under rulers of each other's faith. They are part of a syncretist way of life that has points of mutual contact and divergence. What matters is simply that those who are conscious of the spirit of civilizational coherence do not interfere with one another's religion. The unity Gandhi vouches for is a shared mode of life, not a shared national form, because it, that is the nation, requires the superintending form of political governance. It is a unity tethered to civilizational routines of common and conflicting interests and social norms. It does not have, nor does it need, in the manner of the typical nationalist and imperialist, clearly defined political boundaries or a clear font of power and obligation. When in Hind Swaraj, his interlocutor asks about the deep enmity between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi is almost cavalier in his denial of any such enmity. Indeed, he thinks the enmity and the conviviality are occasioned by contingent circumstances that almost always admit of indifference, negotiation, and persuasion. Even on the freighted matter of killing cows by Muslims, he would say he would only plead with Muslims. For Gandhi, the issue surrounding the cow was not a political matter, which required the mediation of the blunt power of the state. Notwithstanding his own reverence as a Hindu, notwithstanding which he, as a Hindu, felt towards the cow, he said, quote, "If the Muslim would not listen to me, I should let the cow go for the simple reason that the matter is beyond my ability." End of quote. In some other context, one can well imagine Gandhi being willing to die for those convictions. But his point here is that he does not take the difference between the Muslim attitude towards the cow and his own Hindu reverence for it as sanctioning an escalation of the conflict. Gandhi knows and accepts the fact of occasional conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. But what is striking is the degree to which he views such conflicts as having no necessary or deep escalatory potential. Quote, I do not suggest that Hindus and Mohammedans will never fight. When people are in a rage, they often do foolish things. These we have to put up with. But when we do quarrel, we certainly do not want to engage counsel and to resort to English or any other courts. Two men fight, both have their heads broken, or only one. How shall a third party distribute justice among them? Those who fight may expect to be injured. What is striking, end of quote, what is striking about this and many similar passages is Gandhi's casual equanimity. There is no suggestion that the conflict stems from a deep friend-enemies animus, in which the depth of the antagonism can or should be the foundational ground of a political construct. Gandhi never gives an account of such a conflict, which arises from the essential nature of the two religions, or indeed from anything that has a deeper motivational basis. His thought is strikingly free of such underlying mandates. Instead, in the examples he gives, the conflict is almost always occasioned by and limited by a narrow set of contextual considerations. In Gandhi's rendering, the conflict is merely a foolish act, motivated by a prosaic anger, a kind of schoolyard brawl that will run its course without any implied or necessary escalation, following which one assumes the patterns of social conviviality and distinction would reassert themselves. Even the possibility of heads being broken and hence of violence does not occasion any special concern. Neither does the possibility that perhaps only one party's head gets broken, and hence that the initial situation, the initial conflict may have been between unequally matched opponents. In Gandhi's view, such things just sometimes happen without being the precursors to anarchy. What did deeply matter to Gandhi, what did deeply trouble Gandhi, and which at numerous times in Hind Swaraj and elsewhere he returns to, is the idea that conflict requires the mediation of, quote unquote, a third party. Gandhi is insistent in his refusal to countenance such mediation, be it of the law with its warrant of justice, or of the imperial state as the guarantor of peace, or peace, order, and a progressive historical alignment, or the national state as it vouches for equality and through representation acts on behalf of presumes to act on behalf of the public interests. Elsewhere, Gandhi writes, we Hindus and Muslims should be ashamed to take our quarrels to the British, end of quote, making it clear that for him, the issue of seeking mediation, where the warrant for the mediator lay in his or her superior power and alleged objectivity, was fraught with both psychological and ethical considerations. They all interject a dependence, which Gandhi thinks is the hidden essence of modern civilization, in which the security and deepest values become reliant and abstracted projections of power. Hence, they obviate the conditions required for self-knowledge. Let me move to say something about courage. On the morning of February 24th, 1919, in a context vitiated by the recent introduction of the Rowlatt Bills, which proposed to all but explicitly suspend the individual rights of Indians, along with their rights of association and assembly, Gandhi, along with others, issued the Satyagr Pledge, that is the call for civil disobedience. It was an act which he called, quote unquote, the most momentous in the history of India. The pledge stated, quote, that in the event of these bills becoming law and until they're withdrawn, we shall refuse civilly to obey the laws. And we further affirm that in this struggle, we will faithfully follow truth and refrain from violence to life, person, and property, or property. In a telegram sent on the same day to the Viceroy's private secretary, Gandhi again emphasized that the proposed national satyagraha was to be a civil form of action. As he said, it is, quote, much better that people say openly what they have in their hearts without fear of the consequences and enforce the dictates of their conscience, end of quote. Why did civility, on his understanding, turn on notions such as conscience, truth, suffering, the dictates of the heart, the ability to be steadfast, the practice of fasting, the injunction to refrain from designating an enemy, the courage of being prepared to stand alone, and of course, abjuring from all forms of violence? Why did it ultimately rest on a willingness to be prepared to sacrifice one's life? In brief, what was the civil component of such actions, which in its rigors was so starkly internal, relying as it did above all else on the internal resoluteness of the individual? For Gandhi, civility was a mode of individual comportment, which had this crucial feature of tying ethics to politics. Civility referred to that kernel of what it meant to be human, that ember in the midst of social and political life that had the potential of constantly unsettling or inflaming those contexts with demands that invariably exceeded the contours of the social and political by pointing to something beyond them. It referred to a metaphysical core of what it meant to be human, because of that, it could not be abstracted from issues of death, sacrifice, and courage. Ultimately, for Gandhi, civility represented the ineradicable presence and challenge of the absolute in the midst of everyday routines of life and struggle. As Gandhi said in a speech on March 7th, 1919, quote, Satyagraha was a harmless but unfailing remedy. It presupposes a superior sort of courage in those who adopt it. Not the courage of the fighter. The soldier was undoubtedly ready to die, but he also wanted to kill the enemy. A satyagraha was ever ready to endure suffering and lay down his life to demonstrate to the world the integrity of his purpose and the justice of his demands. His weapon was faith in God, and he lived and worked in that faith. In that faith, there is no room for killing or violence, none for untruth. End of quote. Gandhi's emphasis on individual courage and integrity, which he identified and anchored. Gandhi's emphasis was on individual courage and integrity, which he identified as anchored in faith. Gandhi was clearly resistant to linking civility solely with the claims of justice, thus giving them an independent normative credence that such that their gravity alone was the basis of behavior. Even though Satyagraha was projected as a national response to the bills, it was clear that in all the conditions and constraints that Gandhi placed on its public form and the demanding personal conditions that had to be met, that it was hardly designed to give a fillip to mass action. In a speech given in Madras, he explicitly stated that it is not the number of signatories, but rather the purity and willingness of their sacrifice. As he said, quote, he must make a continuous effort to love his opponent. He must be prepared to go through every form of suffering, whether imposed upon him by the government, which he is civilly resisting, or by those who may differ from him. This movement is thus a process of purification and penance. Believe me, if we go through it in the right spirit, the Rowlatt bills will be withdrawn and the country will recognize in Satyagraha a powerful religious weapon. End of quote. Gandhi's comment recalls what he says in Hind Swaraj, where he asserted that Swaraj itself did not require a mass movement, that it could be had, quote, in an instant by the genuine courage and fortitude of a few people. If one views such comments as empirical predictions, in that case, their warrant seems implausible and unduly optimistic. But such a perspective misses the point. These comments suggest how on Gandhi's reckoning, the logic of political transformation was itself susceptible to civil and ethical practices, which were pegged to self-suffering and indifferent to familiar political and social categories, and which therefore defied the very terms in which politics understood itself. Patience, the theme of not wanting to be rushed, of slowing down, of emphasizing patience as a capacious virtue, runs through Hind Swaraj and Gandhi's other writings with unmistakable constancy. There is an explicit appeal to the importance of patience regarding just about all the substantive issues discussed by Gandhi throughout his long career and in all his writings. He said at the conclusion of the chapter entitled Hind Swaraj, quote, there is need for patience. It is difficult for me to understand the true nature of Swaraj as it seems to you, that is the reader, easy. End of quote. Gandhi was pointing to a double contrast, not merely between his views and those of his interlocutor, but also in the ease and rapidity with which each arrived and held their respective views. For Gandhi, the comportment appropriate to Swaraj in its many forms involved a difficult challenge, which not only ultimately, but rather from the very outset, drew on the complex interiority of the self. That claim distinguished him from the typical nationalist for whom national self-rule bore the imprimatur of moral and political self-evidence. There is something puzzling about the claim that Swaraj is difficult, just as there is something strange in Gandhi's demurring in answering the question, what Swaraj is. In Hind Swaraj, as elsewhere, Gandhi was hesitant in announcing his views in a declarative manner. Instead, he emphasized the difficulties in the way of Hind Swaraj, or in the way of Swaraj, and the quality of patience that was requisite to coming to those views. What is the importance of patience in achieving the comportment appropriate to Swaraj? Were those difficulties epistemic and cognitive, matters of knowledge and understanding, or did Gandhi, in flagging them, have something else in mind? Were Gandhi's disagreements with his interlocutor merely matters of opinion, knowledge, or tactics? Or did they, perhaps more importantly, refer to ways in which one comes to hold and embody opinions, and thus to the quality of being and the patterns of life that the opinions exemplified. Yet opinions arrived at with patience hold us steady or indicate a steadiness in us, as the Sanskrit and Hindi word dheeraj suggests. Was patience a kind of moral and psychological adhesive that embedded values into the self, thereby not allowing moral abstractions to serve as a surrogate for the moral self? Patience was a lure against living vicariously, the secret condition that made modern existence so appealing. Such questions gather in their implications many of the reasons that make Gandhi not just a profound thinker with acute judgment and analysis, but also a penetrating and acute moral psychologist. For Gandhi, moral and political matters always required more than epistemic and normative clarity. Patience for Gandhi refers to an essential and underlying condition for crafting a way of being or a state of inwardness that stresses the importance of self-knowledge as a condition of moral and politically salutary action. It has as its antonym moral and political abstraction and vicarious forms of existence. For Gandhi, patience sediments opinions, beliefs, and values. It gives them a mold. Modern civilizations, in contrast, gave people inducements to live life as though it was somebody else's, freed of his prejudices and often arbitrary constraints. It was pegged to an imaginative fantasy. It invited people to be different than who they were on the shallow assumption that such transference was without cost to the self and to others. Patience for Gandhi was a redress to a similar worry. In the Indian context, it was a worry about the empire and nationalists, the inducements of progress, such as modern forms of living and life, all of which were indifferent to the real needs of the self. To add to this, there were the emerging social conditions, which increasingly recessed those needs and offered instead the seductive emollient of politics, material well-being, and power and violence. Gandhi's view of time and duration is ultimately psychological. It is directed at the individual and at the conditions through which individuals can secure a mature and self-confident selfhood. It abjures the abstraction implicit in moral principles. Gandhi expresses none of the urgency of a typical nationalist, precisely because he was not that. He interjects time and duration at every possible juncture. Modern civilization works by a kind of subterfuge. According to Gandhi, it makes the body a stand-in for the whole self. In doing so, it gives us an investment in the surface of things. In contrast, practices such as spinning, celibacy, fasting, and silence, which I said last time, in which Gandhi in his later years came to endorse, all have the effect of amplifying the internal domain of the self. These practices have no real external outcome. They cannot and do not encourage an investment in something external. They are, in a manner, wholly contained by the act. They are forms of gymnasia, exercises done when naked. Religion. The final chapter of Hind Swaraj, Gandhi makes the following observations and claim. Quote, "You English have not come to India, who have come to India are not a good specimen of the English nation, nor can we, almost half anglicized Indians, be considered good specimens of the real Indian nation. If the English nation knew if the English nation were to know all that you have done, it would oppose many of your actions. The mass of Indians have had few dealings with you. If you will abandon your so-called civilization and search into your own scriptures, you will find our demands are just. Only on that condition, only on the condition of our demands being fully satisfied, may you remain in India. And if you remain under those conditions, we shall learn several things from you, and you will learn many things from us. So doing, we shall benefit from each other and the world. But for that to happen, but that will happen only when the root of our relationship is sunk in a religious soil. End of quote. Gandhi was concerned with three issues in this passage. The first, with the fact that the English and half-Anglicized Indians betrayed their real and best national traditions and inheritances. They are quite literally poor moral specimens of the genus of which, in the present, they are taken to be representatives. Regarding the former group, Gandhi believes that their actions would be disapproved of by the English nation were it to become fully aware of them. English in India operate in a kind of moral penumbra and penetrate a kind of moral subterfuge against the English people. It is a subterfuge that is not fully evident to Indians because few of them have any dealings with the English. This theme is one of self-betrayal and moral occlusion by both the English and the Indians. The second issue relates to the conditions that distort the mutual understanding between the two groups. The reason for this distortion is the extant context of the interaction, the imperial context. But Gandhi does not name it as such, with its conspicuous associations with a regime of unequal power and racialized differentiations. As a general matter, in his more reflective writings, Gandhi avoids the term imperialism. Gandhi's purposes exceed the political relationship by pointing to something deeper that underlies and disfigures it. Instead, he identifies the context through a broader reference. It is modern civilization that confines and distorts the relations between the English and the Indians. What Gandhi has in mind are the grand historical narratives that wedded a conception of progress and a corresponding belief in the differentials of power and elevation. Gandhi is contending that such narratives make mutual learning impossible because they are premised on the immaturity of one group and the temporal assurance of a particular outcome. Even if a conversation between the English and the Indians were to occur, it would be premised on one of them being superior and the other inferior. This imbalance makes it difficult for the English to appreciate the justice of the demands being made by the Indians, because a particular conception of justice has already been written into those historical narratives. Instead, Gandhi suggests that mutual learning and the claims of justice would only become clear to the English if they sought guidance in, quote, their own scriptures, rather than in a warrant of history. Third, in a more prescriptive voice, Gandhi writes of the conditions that would rectify both the hindrances in the way of mutual understanding and the self-betrayal within each group. Regarding these conditions, Gandhi speaks of the essential need to return to scripture and of rooting the relationship between the English and the Indians in, quote, a religious soil. Gandhi's primary concern is a need for a self-searching. In Gandhi's view, a return to scripture is essential to this self-searching. He is insistent that only a relationship anchored in a religious seedbed holds the potential for each group to self-search. Moreover, in this repositioned relationship between the English and the Indians, he says the broader world would learn from their interaction. And suggestively, there would be perhaps the possibility to which this passage hints that, and Gandhi makes explicit reference, that there might be no reason for the English to decamp from India. The themes of self-betrayal, distortion brought about by modern civilization, and the need to anchor mutual relations in the language of scripture and religiosity are a digest on the broader issues that matter deeply to Gandhi. They suggest both a positive purpose and a refusal to think in familiar terms. Gandhi is refusing the categories which by the early 20th century and with redoubled zeal in the decades that follow had come to suffuse the discourse between imperial relations on both sides. He does not, for example, speak of exploitation, inequality, racism, the differentials of power, the absence of political representation, economic miserization, or quotidian forms of violence, and the warrant and urgency of national independence, even though in different degrees, all these matter to him. Similarly, from a positive perspective, he does not engage with the idea of progress, the integration of India and the world, of a modernity that moved India away from feudal and obscurantist norms, and which carried the imprimatur of science, the prospect of democratic self-governance, and other mandates of a progressive future. As he comes to conclude his discourse on home and self-rule, all these categories seem at best secondary to Gandhi's ultimate purpose. Instead, his summation, both critically and positively, points to an importance of scripture and the language of religion. It is the muffling and the displacement of this language that obscures what for Gandhi is the most basic and essential fact of the empire and of modern civilization, namely that it imperils the moral hygiene of both the English and the Indians. Why is Gandhi so insistent that a relationship fraught with so many vexations should be thought through the language of scripture and religion? Gandhi's views on religion and his own religiosity are highly complex. This is not the context to propose even a cursory summary of that complexity. What is relevant is that he associates religion in its diverse forms as something given, into which one is, as it were, arbitrarily cast. Gandhi's main preoccupation is with infusing the mundane aspects of life with meaning and moral depth, which for him turn ultimately on religious considerations that have to do with submission, where submission itself is not understood in terms of a willed act or a choice, but rather as something which, quote, seizes the person, and which therefore suggests a form of surrender. This is a thought familiar to many religious traditions regarding how faith is understood. Faith is not chosen, but is constitutive of believers. They give themselves up to it. The view that faith is simply the language through which we pursue self-knowledge captures Gandhi's own understanding of religion and faith. It is linked with Gandhi's idea that the social is a prevenient mesh of interconnections. This is what allows Gandhi to affirm different religions with equal, as being equally sanctified, while also claiming to be a devout Hindu. And it also explains his resistance to missionaries' attempt to change people's religion. Religion with a special poignancy constitutes the language which abounded civilization, in abounded civilization made meaningful to individuals and communities. It limits choice, but it also deepens its potential application. Gandhi never identifies religion as the basis for forging a homogeneous unity that could serve as a buttress to the nation or to any broad identity for that matter. But he does think of religion, he does not think of religion in terms of faith, rather as modes of living, which make possible coexistence without having to lean on shared identities that must almost of necessity be secured and invigilated by a third party. It is instead a diverse inheritance, the grammar and minutiae through which the pursuit of self-knowledge is carried out in the practice of everyday life. That practice, because it involves a deep and constant attunement to the question, who am I? Which for Gandhi is ultimately a spiritual pursuit. Thank you.
Thank you, Uday. Before I introduce our two our discussants respectively, let me say a little bit about the format for audience participation. We will follow the rules of the Zoom universe. Namely, the audience can use the chat function and send us their comments and questions in the chat room. And between Grace, who is our technical wizard, and we will pick up the questions, at least some of the questions, and in any case, pass on the entire set of questions and comments to the discussants and the speaker. I can assure you that a post-event discussion does take place. It did on Wednesday when one of the questions couldn't be accommodated, and it led to some debate through email between the discussants, the speaker, and the moderator. So that's what we'll do. We'll use the chat. Please use the chat function and go to the chat room and send us your thoughts on what Uday has just said about Gandhi's critique of political rationality, or what the upcoming discussants might say about that. Our first discussant is Karuna Mantena. She's a professor of political science at Columbia University, where she's been since 2019. If I'm wrong about that, she'll correct me. After her PhD from Harvard, she spent some time at Cornell. In fact, all three main participants today have some Cornell background. Uday, Juliet, as well as Karuna. But she taught for roughly 15 years at Yale after her PhD at Harvard, and then came to Columbia a couple of years ago. Her first book was entitled Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism. That did intersect with, I guess, that's my supposition, with Uday's book on Liberalism and Empire, which, as I said, was eye-opening for me. But the more relevant parts of Karuna's intellectual ambit are the two essays she has already published on Gandhi. Gandhi's one in American Political Science Review called Another Realism, A second in modern intellectual history on Gandhi's critique of the state. And she is preparing a new manuscript, should be ready soon, I think. I've heard about it for quite some time from her as well, tentatively entitled Gandhi's Realism, Means and Ends in Politics. So Karuna, this audience is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you, Ashutosh, for that very gracious introduction. It is a real privilege to be here in this conversation. I have been fortunate to work in Uday's gentle shadow for many years, working on grounds that his path-breaking book on liberalism and empire opened up, and now his provocative and poignant work on Gandhi. What Uday has so powerfully delineated is Gandhi's understanding of the grounds of self-knowledge. The seductions and demands of civilization pose a fundamental challenge to self-knowledge because they continually drive us outside of ourselves. As Gandhi writes in Hind Swaraj, quote, "The mind is a restless bird. The more it gets, the more it wants, and still remains unsatisfied. The more we indulge our passions, the more unbridled they become." In modern civilization, this is the mental unrest that comes from making, quote, "bodily welfare the object of life." We seek happiness in luxury, in comfort, ease, invent newer machines to facilitate convenience without realizing that we are enthralled to a fantasy of ease and contentment that never arrives. And instead, we become ever more enmeshed in abstract and anonymous systems of dependence and domination. The nationalist response, as Uday has so clearly articulated, misdiagnoses the problem of colonialism not as a loss of self, but one of military and political defeat, and hence can only imagine a political response in the form of replicating the institutions of the modern state and generating a rival form of collective power. This only redoubles the problems of vicariousness and abstraction. This occurs not only in the ends that nationalism seeks, but in the political means it employs and recommends. Political action also drives one outside of oneself. The mind of militant nationalism, for example, that of Madan Lal Dhingra, whose assassination of William Curzon Wiley had sparked the writing of Hind Swaraj, Gandhi characterizes as agitated and frenzied. Though there was undoubtedly some bravery in Dhingra's act, it was done in a state of, quote, intoxication, not of wine or bhang, but drunk on a mad idea, which allowed him to banish temporarily the fear of death. But this was not true courage. For as Uday has shown us, courage must be preceded with thoughtful, patient reflection. Given the dangers of the loss of self, self-knowledge, betrayal of self, Gandhi's fundamental interest was a profound inward turning, as Uday has shown us, and specifically towards the self that is anchored in the sphere of everyday life, the social, which Uday describes as the family, religion, face-to-face practices, depth, slowness, and patience. These were the grounds of self-knowledge, practices and relations that resisted vicariousness and abstraction. This is a sphere that has been so denigrated, again, as Uday so poignantly showed us, by the dominant tradition of modern political thought, especially the social contract tradition, in which the state is necessary because the social not only has no capacity to resist anarchy, but is seen as the site of violence, of exploitation and domination. Many of us, as good readers of Marx and Ambedkar, might bristle at the valorization of the social or the local. But I think Uday is right to insist that Gandhi was indeed committed to the ethical priority of the face-to-face, the intimate. This is captured very neatly in Gandhi's reference. Often when asked to explain Satyagraha, Gandhi would begin by calling it, quote, an extension of the domestic law in the political field. This leads me to my first question or query for Uday. It seems to me that for Gandhi, the moral force of the social or the everyday is understood in two senses. The first is the view of the social that Uday has given a special weight to, as the quotidian space of inheritance, in which opinions, beliefs, values are sedimented and molded, where constraints and limits stem the pull of abstraction, of living lives that are not our own. Uday offers the example of religion here, of Gandhi's Hinduism, as an ethical world born into, indeed thrown into, The bounds and limits are arbitrary, given, inherited, but also necessary, for they serve as the grounds of moral action. But when Gandhi undertakes the project of reforming and restoring dignity to Hinduism by ridding it of the sin of untouchability, it seems to me that Gandhi is trying to elicit a form of moral insight and courage in his fellow Hindus that is not simply quotidian. He is redefining and reconstituting what it means to be a Hindu, and to do so requires altering the given. Such a reform also requires inwardness, self-knowledge, but perhaps points to moral resources that are even more elemental. What I see at work in Gandhi is akin to what David Bromwich, in his remarkable essay, Moral Imagination, characterizes as the two ways in which Burke evokes that idea. The first is the wardrobe of moral imagination, as the space of pre-approved habits and super-added ideas that make us know our duties. Moral imagination allows us to act, quote, in a way that is familiar and precedented. Such action, in Bromwich's reading of Burke, which is maybe a little bit different here, such action is not mere reflex. Within these limits and bounds, we make moral choices that, quote, this is a quote from Burke, the heart owns and the understanding ratifies. This can become heroic when the grounds of moral imagination are threatened, as they were in the case of the French Revolution for Burke and under colonialism for Gandhi. But for Bromwich, Burke exhibited another kind of moral courage and imagination in the campaign against imperial corruption and violence in India. For the British to share Burke's urgency here, Bromwich writes they must break out of domesticating habits, the sedimented in every day, and, quote, recover a natural indignation on behalf of the oppressed. For this not to be a vicarious moral crusade on behalf of distant victims, Burke comes to, quote, assist Indians not from a sense of their suffering, but a sense that his country is its main cause. In Bromwich's words again, quote, the motive for sympathetic action must come from learning the work of truth and constancy that is becoming to one's own dignity. Here, I think the question becomes again one of self-knowledge and moral integrity. Again, in Bromwich's words, the question is not what I owe to the sufferer, but what I owe to myself. Here, the duties to self that ground and motivate the breaking of convention also require self-knowledge, as the cultivation and recovery of what I call it more elemental or latent moral capacities. Here, I think Tolstoy calls it the law of love. These are also rooted in the everyday, perhaps in the more transcendent elements, which I think Gandhi also refers to as religious. But this religion is not a reference to Hinduism or Christianity, but, quote, that religion which underlay all religions, a fundamental moral core that exists in all religions, that all individuals can access or activate or recover via practices of self-discipline that induce introspection. This is the self-knowledge I would suggest Gandhi calls upon in the campaign against untouchability. And it's also the reason why for Gandhi, caste Hindus had to be made to see themselves as the primary agents of reform, because they, like Burke's example of the British in India, were the primary cause of dehumanization. The motive of such action for the caste Hindu had to be a duty to oneself. Thus, in this campaign, Gandhi continually insisted that, quote, untouchability is the sin of the Hindus. They must suffer for it. They must purify themselves. They must pay the debt they owe to their suppressed brothers and sisters. Theirs is the shame, and theirs must be the glory when they have purged themselves of the black sin. Now to my second and final point, which is less a question than an amendment. Uday once said, in his and my work on Gandhi, we often construct the same picture of Gandhi, but the captions underneath, the captions we write underneath that picture are very different, maybe even opposite. So here I'm going to just point to some different implications of what I think is a picture of self-knowledge that we share, and especially that sense of Gandhi as a moral psychologist. So the question that interests me is how the turn to inwardness toward cultivation, care, and discipline of the self inflects Gandhi's understanding of the tasks and demands of political action. At the tail end of Wednesday's discussion, questions were raised about Gandhi's attitude to consequences. In Uday's view, self-knowledge was grounded in a profound and total indifference to consequences. I think one ought to read Gandhi's demand to cultivate indifference to so-called fruits of action to be a moral psychological claim about how to constrain what he calls hankering after that fruit. Understood in this way, renunciation of the fruits of action, in Gandhi's words, quote, in no way means indifference to the results. This is from the introduction Gandhi wrote to accompany his Gujarati translation of the Gita. Here Gandhi writes that the unmistakable teaching of the Gita, quote, is, quote, in regard to every action, one must know the result that is expected to follow, the means thereto, and the capacity for it. He who, being thus equipped, is without desire for the result and is yet wholly engrossed in the due fulfillment of the task before him, and is said to have renounced the fruits of his action. The renunciation that matters in moral psychological terms is the absence of hankering after fruit. Hankering is the name for a desire that induces mental agitation and unrest. To finish the quote, he who is ever brooding over the result often loses nerve in the performance of his duty. He becomes impatient and then gives vent to anger and begins to do unworthy things. He jumps from action to action, never remaining faithful to any. He who broods over results is like a man given to objects of senses. He is ever distracted. He says goodbye to all scruples. Everything is right in his estimation, and he therefore resorts to means fair and foul to attain his end. This hankering, this impatient brooding has directly political implications. For such agitation that leads to the impatient desire for immediate results in politics is equivalent to, is also what Gandhi will call the search, quote, for short, violent cuts to success. This reflection was written in the late 1920s when Gandhi was engaged in a vociferous debate with his Congress colleagues on the meaning of Swaraj. Nehru, among others, wanted to declare an open and complete break with Britain, a refusal to settle for Dominion status, culminating in the famous Purna Swaraj resolution. Moreover, younger and radical voices, again, like Nehru's, wanted to convey more forthrightly socialist and egalitarian commitments when defining Swaraj. Gandhi resisted both, and for a specific reason. Gandhi thought rousing speeches and political agitation around the particular definition of Swaraj would not lead to its realization. Quote, the real definition will be determined by our action, the means we adopt to achieve the goal. If we would but concentrate upon the means, Swaraj will take care of itself. And here I think, again, concentration on the means is not indifferent to the result, but it is the way in which you get to the result. Gandhi's alternative vision of Swaraj and the remedy to political agitation was the constructive program. And here Kadi was central, as Uday again has emphasized, as a practice that cultivates inwardness, controls passion and anger, and prepares one for both Satyagraha and Swaraj. Turning inward was turning to the immediate silent work of construction, which builds up Swaraj from below, but also acts as a bulwark against the disappointments, impatience, impotence that ignite in politics the moral psychology of shortcuts and violence. I'll end there.
So Uday, I asked you whether you would like to respond to Karuna first, or you'd like to collect both sets of comments.
Let's do both. Okay.
The second discussant is my colleague, Juliet Hooker. She came to us from University of Texas, Austin. She taught there for 15 years. And she joined us in 2017. And before Austin, she took a PhD from Cornell. Her work specializes in racial justice, multiculturalism, Black political thought, and Latin American political thought, and she has authored Race and the Politics of Solidarity, Theorizing Race in the Americas, and has also written about Black Lives Matter in political theory, and Black protest and white grievance, and on the problem of, very interesting paper, on the problem of white political imaginations not shaped by loss. on the problem of white political imaginations not shaped by laws. I have invited Juliet for a particular reason. I think comparative reflections based on a study, especially of African American thought, will enrich our understanding about how to preserve or recover self-respect under conditions of extreme dominance. And it is very clear from Martin Luther King's writings, and I also visited Atlanta on a civil rights trip two years back and went through all the museums and all the monuments to him. And the influence of Gandhi on Martin Luther King in particular is very profound. It's very clear from the writings and from the civil rights trips to Atlanta. So that's the reason I thought Juliet will say something that will be very illuminating and that will teach us a lot. So Juliet, next 10 minutes yours.
Thank you, Ashu, and I appreciate you specifying for me that I don't work on Gandhi, and so I do appreciate the possibility of being in dialogue with Uday and with Karuna. I've learned a lot from Uday's work and have also enjoyed my engagements with Karuna as well. So I will jump right in into my thoughts about this excellent paper. In this rigorous and careful engagement with Gandhi's thought, Uday Mehta has given us an original and persuasive account of Gandhi as a primarily religious or spiritual thinker whose ideas about politics followed up closely and coherently from those spiritual commitments. Uday argues that while Gandhi has been associated with the major political events of the 20th century, decolonization, the fight against racial apartheid, the critique of war and violence, a critique of consumerism, a skepticism regarding the role of technology, and more generally, bringing the common man and woman into the fold of public life, which has led to Gandhi being seen as in the main a political thinker, someone whose views don't simply have political implications, but is seen as somebody who actually thought in political terms, that his ideal was somehow conceived in terms that were themselves political. Uday thoroughly rejects this view. Instead, he argues that Gandhi was entirely unconcerned with the principal preoccupations that drive modern political thought. He argues that in, quote, the rationality of modern political thought, conflict and even uncertainty precipitates an imagining of the slide down the slippery slope that culminates in anarchy. In this slide, the social is viewed as having lost its historical capacity to offer any resistance or as an alternative model to the political. The family, religious community, friendships, the conventions and practices of social clubs, individual self-discipline, in brief, the conviviality and conflict that are the marks of everyday practices with their ethical density cannot retard, let alone obviate the slide towards utter desolation and anarchy, end quote. In contrast to this hegemonic modern view, Uday situates Gandhi as a thinker who valued the social in its various forms because in his view, they were the grounds through which self-realization was achieved. They were central to achieving his spiritual commitments, which the state, the paradigmatic actor and locus of concern in modern political thought, could not. Thus, he argues that Gandhi, in contrast to someone like Hobbes, did not give security, either individual or collective, any priority. He did not privilege borders, identity, unity, or the nation for that fact. Rather, he thought in civilizational terms. He did not think that toleration had to be valued as an independent value, which required the vigilance and mediation of the state. He did, however, place a high value on individual courage because it was the marker of a readiness for freedom and maturity. In brief, he was opposed and suspicious of the sort of mediation and reliance on the power, especially a reliance on the power of the state and its institutions, end quote. So Uday's reading of Gandhi is important because it recuperates his religious or spiritual commitments as central and indeed driving his political action. something that I think we as political theorists who are writing at a time when religious authorization for political action provokes discomfort are often want to sidestep or downplay in our engagement with thinkers who have these kinds of spiritual commitments. This is true, I think, of African-American thinkers as well, and particularly of Martin Luther King, who of course has this very deep relationship with Gandhi, as Uday mentioned, who is often read as a theorist of civil disobedience, like Gandhi, in a way that obviates their religious commitments. I think this is true of both if we think about the way in which there's a lot of engagement by many people who are writing about civil disobedience with both of these thinkers. But in Cornel West's reading of the tension in King's political thought between hope and despair, for example, he argues that King commits himself to hope, and this choice is inseparable from his religious commitments. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about in this moment where we're also facing the same, a moment of real racial reckoning, one in which, in some ways, we can see in the United States, we can see parallels to the moment in which King, after the victory of civil rights, which seemed hollow, followed by the riots that were beginning to appear before he died, and the way and tensions that he was seeing with other leaders in, in the Black community, that we see a moment in which King is really grappling with this question of how not to give in to despair, and really, I think, having to find reasons for hope. And so it's interesting to think about what does it mean that he finds hope really through a kind of religious vision, and to think about what that tells us about how we can use his political thought in a moment in which he might be facing some similar questions, at the same time as we don't have, for many of us, the same kinds of religious commitments that he did. And this brings me to thinking about Gandhi in these terms as well. One of the achievements of Uday's reading of Gandhi is that it shows him as a thoroughly coherent thinker, one who is, in his words, a deeply consistent thinker. But is consistency necessarily a virtue? I raise this question in order to ask Uday about how Gandhi's fusion of religion and politics might or might not offer resources for thinking about the present moment. In political theory, I think particularly since the modern era, religious commitment has been seen as detracting in some ways from political action, right? So you're committed, you have these commitments that take you away from politics or make politics seem unimportant, or they're the drivers of conflict for which you require the mediation of the state. And so in thinking about these questions, I think when we look at the moment we're in today, however, rather than avoid the state or avoid politics, it seems like what we're seeing is an increased willingness of religious believers to use the power of the state to try to stem the tide of secularism, and to use it as a bulwark in culture wars and religious contests. So how does Gandhi and your reading of him help us to make sense of this turn? And does he offer resources for how to move beyond it? I also want to raise a question about the role of faith in politics. In his book on what he sees as the courageous, indeed heroic response of the Crow leader Plenikow to the devastation of settler colonialism, this is Radical Hope, Jonathan Lear considers what can motivate action in the face of cultural devastation. Plenikow's hope was animated by religious faith, Lear argues, and he argues that we can still take that hope and make a secular case for it. But one of the questions raised by critics of the book is that this kind of faith is essentially a teleological suspension of politics. That is, that because of his religious faith, he believed that there would be if the Crow adopted certain practices, that they would be able to survive in some form. And so I wonder if we think about this in relation to your discussion of some of the elements of Gandhi's political thought, including his views of civility and patience, to which it seems faith is central, right? To the way in which he understands civility, to the way in which he understands, patience. When we believe that suffering is transformative and or that there will be a positive outcome to our sacrifices and to the courageous acts we undertake, do we correctly assess the challenges we're facing? Is there a danger that we misdiagnose both what constitutes courage, or that whether courage is the virtue we need in the face of those these moments of potential radical transformation? And also, I think here about the role of faith in how we think about what constitutes courage. So thank you very much for a really interesting paper, and I really appreciated being able to engage with it.
Thank you, Juliet. Uday, would you like to respond?
Yes, Ashu. Thank you both for your comments. Juliet, I'll respond to you first. I read Jonathan Lear's book several years ago, so I may be misremembering what he has to say. But as I recall, in his account of the crow, isn't it? One of the things Lear is most impressed by is their willingness to be patient. In the face of this devastation. At some point in the book, he talks about this this guy who reinterprets a dream, that reinterpretation, as I recall, had many of the features that I'm saying made Gandhi a powerful thinker. I think, this is, my memory is not that good, I thought the constituents of that dream were precisely that it had a certain link with what was going on with the crew people. And yet it involved that creative transformation. I don't think that fully answers your question, but it's also a way in which I can or should segue to Karuna's very thoughtful comments. And I agree with you. I agree with you that there is an important distinction to be made between giving up on the fruits of action and hankering after action. So if I understood you correctly, what you were saying was, it's not that Gandhi thinks we should give up on the fruits of action. It's that we should be aware of them and yet not hanker for them, right? Is that what you're saying? I agree with that. I agree with that. I mean, I think I'm just going to restate what I think is the larger point. It's that you have pointed to a particular kind of anxiety in the self, which is anxiety provoked by hankering. My contention is to agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. And I just did not get into the different kinds of psychological psychological complexities that attend to different forms of vicarious existence. So, correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying there can be various kinds of vicariousness. One is to actually think you are different than who you are. The other is to think that, to act in such a way that it distorts your personality, and that can take many, many forms. So there is a particular kind of a distortion linked to hankering. I agree with you. So let me, because I don't think I've been that clear, let me restate what I'm saying. I think where you and I agree is in this idea of distortion. Where you and I disagree is distortion one thing, or are there within it different kinds of distortion? And there I concede there are different kinds of distortion. And hankering refers to one of them. So,
okay. This actually leads me to a Weberian idea, which I had briefly mentioned before we came on public line. And this also connects with something you said on Wednesday about Gandhi's anti-consequentialism. And I think Karuna is also saying something about that it's not wholesale rejection of consequences. This is what Max Weber has to say when he draws a distinction between instrumental rationality, which is highly consequence-based, and if the action leads to a consequence which is extremely costly, then cost-benefit calculus would lead you to reevaluate or amend your action. So that your search becomes much more instrumentally rational or optimal, right? But he also introduces the notion of value rationality, Max Weber. And that's also, he said, it's not unmindful of consequences, value rationality. It is mindful of consequences, but it's a different kind of consequence that it's looking for. So to quote him, value rational behavior, as opposed to instrumentally rational behavior, is produced by a conscious ethical, aesthetic, religious, or other belief independently of its prospects of success. End of quote. Behavior, and then a little later, behavior when driven by such values can consciously embrace great personal sacrifices, but it is goal-directed. It is not unmindful of goals, and it's not unmindful of consequences. How would you react to this Weberian distinction between value rationality and instrumental rationality? In Gandhi, certainly most people would agree Gandhi is not instrumentally rational.
Yeah.
He's not an economist in political action.
Yeah.
He's not. But he is thinking there is serious goal-directed activity here. And as Juliet is saying, this goal-directed activity is not confined to it does not lead to withdrawal from politics and internal self-realization. It keeps bringing him back to politics and changing the world, ending untouchability, trying to persuade the British to at least change their ways, though they can stay on in India even after independence of India. Yes, that passage is very remarkable. And in other places also he said that. And actually in Hind Swaraj he says that also. The British don't have to leave, and they can stay on in India, but they have to change their ways.
Yes.
Right. So there is a sense in which I'm urging you to consider the idea that he's not entirely anti-consequential. And internal self-realization is an extremely important goal, perhaps of paramount importance. But changing the world, ending untouchability, getting independence, and changing the upper caste Hindu, reforming the upper caste Hindu, convincing him that untouchability is a sin that he has been practicing, right? This is all, is it not part of any consequential reasoning that you would envision?
So Ashu, one can change people through many means. One is setting a particular example. It's what Akil Bilgrami has called exemplarity. So you can say to somebody, look at me, without saying you ought to do this. So in the Kantian framework, you always have an ought. In the exemplarity framework, you have no such thing as an ought. The way you're trying to bring about change is by saying, this is who I am. And leaving it at that. So, and this, I think, relates to the other thing you brought out. Is he indifferent to consequences? I may have said last time that he is indifferent to consequences. I think the way in which he is indifferent to consequences is that one shouldn't aspire to something that they may just happen. There's a certain kind of aleatoriness, chancefulness in inconsequential behavior. I mean, look, think of it this way. I pick up this pen, and no, this is not a good example. So, I mean, so the point I'm making, and I know I'm repeating myself here, is that one can have consequences without intending them. And I think of consequentialism as the doctrine where behavior is intentional, that you're anticipating certain consequences, and therefore you're acting on that. So it's
so instrumental rationality for you is a sign of consequentialism, but value rationality, as Weber puts it, is not. That's not consequentialism, right?
Yes.
So when Gita says, karmanyavadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, that your job is to do your duty and not think of consequences.
Yes.
One way to interpret that is as if you believe in that. One way is the Ashish Nandi way of interpreting that. If you believe in that, if you say your job is to undertake and fulfill your duty and not to think of consequences, if you do that, then you will create very serious problems to the modern state, because the modern state will not find enough space to fill its prisons with those who are breaking the law and who commit themselves to this idea that they will do what their duty is regardless of consequences. Yeah. So as Nandi puts it, if jails become sites of pilgrimage, following karmanyavadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, if jails become sites of pilgrimage, then modern state will be defeated at some point. It cannot use its standard modes of punishment to deter this kind of behavior. Deterrence disappears, right? Yes. So karmanyavadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana actually would lead to more effective change, even though those who are engaging in that kind of action are not thinking of consequences. I think that's what you mean, perhaps.
Yes, that is what I mean.
That fairly profound change might happen by people acting according to an ethical ideal and never compromising, and turning jails into sites of pilgrimage. Yes,
that's I think that's what Gandhi has in mind. I'm just interpreting Gandhi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Karuna and Juliet, do you have any more comments on what you heard, or your counter response to what Uday is saying, or anything else that we've discussed?
I can say something very quickly, but I see there's a lot of questions coming. So
I will pick up some questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think I want to just say that I think the only amendment I was trying to say is, and I think I completely agree, that there are many ways to think about hankering. And I think it was just to say that I think this is a way to rethink what Gandhi thinks political action is. And so it's just to say that inwardness, as we've returned to, inwardness doesn't mean a withdrawal from politics. Of course, it couldn't. That's the lesson of the Gita. You can't withdraw. But it does, I think, also give different lessons for orientation. The only one amendment I want to say is, I think lots of questions are coming on ethics of intentions and consequences. But I guess the question I would ask Uday is, I wonder to what extent, I often think that the distinction between intention and consequences especially in the Weberian form or the Kantian form, really doesn't apply to Gandhi, because Gandhi is about action, which is integral, that includes both. And so it seems much more like in, as in Tolstoy, lived, ethics is always lived. You can't have it. There is no separation between intention and consequence. So you don't have to reply. Again, there's lots of other questions, but I just wanted to put that.
Yeah.
So here is a question, Uday, from Sanjay Ruparelia. He has two, I'll pick one. Does Gandhi's understanding of an insistence on patience have no temporal dimension at all? You mentioned in your first lecture that he did not subscribe to a conventional understanding of historical causality. Today you mention that Swaraj required patience, because creating a new settled disposition, a new way of being, was very hard and took serious effort. But does he have anything to say about how long should the subaltern wait to realize their emancipation? Do the subaltern have to put up with the subaltern condition forever? And is there a way in which he says there could be actually a temporal dimension to how the subaltern view their emancipation?
I mean,
your answer is perhaps no.
I think, I don't know if he ever talks about the temporal limit. I think what most concerns him is you have to wait till the other side is persuaded. I don't know if that means how long one should wait for. I mean, given Gandhi's emphasis on the importance of self-sacrifice, I would not be surprised if Gandhi said, yeah, you should wait for a long time, even to the point of dying, you should wait. Yeah.
Right. Here is a question from Sanjay Reddy. A procedural conception of rationality, whether based on duties, for example, the Kantian conception, or personal integrity, for example, Gandhi's fearless courage, is difficult to make full sense of without some reference to the outcomes that are likely to arise under different courses of action. The actions that are valuable to undertake derive their rationale in part from the outcomes they aim to achieve. That is to say, this is who I am is while an important motivation, may not be entirely irrelevant to considering what outcomes may obtain from acting out, this is who I am. So once again, it takes you towards the idea of whether consequences can be entirely eliminated, even within a Gandhian conception of duty. I've summarized it, it's in the interest of time, what Sanjay is saying. So whether it's Kantian or Gandhian, consequences will come back to, inevitably will come back.
I honestly don't understand the question. So let me speak aloud. Is Sanjay asking, can Gandhi avoid consequences? Can Gandhi really be indifferent to consequences?
Yeah.
And I think, yes. I think the way all of this ties together is if you don't think of Gandhi as having primarily a political objective. So I mean, one of the consequences could be we don't get independence. I don't know if Gandhi would be indifferent to I think he'd be indifferent to that. I don't think he'd be disappointed by that. What I think he cares about most is changing himself and changing the other. And that is a particular kind of consequentialism, but it's not ordinarily thought of as consequentialism.
So I think you're returning to this idea that consequentialism is equal to instrumental rationality, the way economists think about consequences, a cost-benefit calculus, changing your action on the basis of a cost-benefit calculus, and the cost-benefit calculus will stem from an evaluation of the consequences of your action, right? So anything other than that you will not call consequentialism. It's something else.
Yes, it's something
whatever term we use with something else. It's not right.
I mean, you're right.
Okay. Any final comments, Karuna and Juliet and Uday, before we close? Let me see if I have something else here. Well, in any case, Juliet, do you have some more thoughts on what you heard?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this has made me think about, I do agree, Uday, that I think that some of the same virtues that Lear identifies in Pleniku are some of the same ones that you identify in Gandhi, which is why it came to mind when I was reading your essay. But I do think that maybe there's a difference in terms of, because for Pleniku, the thing that animates him is this idea of the survival of his people.
You what?
The thing that animates it, right, the driving force is the hope for the survival of his people. Yeah. And so there's personal transformation that is required in that, but it is for the sake of that hope, right, or that goal. And it seems like what you're saying is that in that case, there's a much more, and I may be reading you wrong, a much more concerned with the practices of self-transformation in Gandhi that is not necessarily linked in this way to that, that are important in and of themselves, separate from the that kind of collective goal.
Ashu, do we have time for her to repeat herself?
Yeah, sure. We have. So, Juliet, can you repeat what you said? We have 4 minutes left here. Juliet, can you hear me?
Yeah, so I'm just saying, right, that you just said just now that for Gandhi, for example, you think it would have been fine for there not to have been independence because the goal was self-transformation. Whereas I think in the case of the Crow, the self-transformation happens in the interest of making possible the goal of the survival of the group.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a difference there, is all I'm saying. To come back to.
Yeah, I see the difference. I see the difference. I mean, do you think of that difference as being an absolute difference? Or can it actually be, is it a mathematical difference? Can it be divided? I think it can be divided,
We have some. Yeah. Go
I
ahead,
don't
go
think
ahead.
I've answered
Finish
your
your
question.
Yeah. There is one more here, which maybe we have time. We have 3 minutes left, so let's try this one. This is, does Gandhi ever think of or discuss? We know his objection to modern political rationality and a Hobbesian understanding of what modern politics is supposed to do, supposed to make you secure and take away the fear of death through the intervention of the state and laws. Does Gandhi ever discuss what would be the consequences of complete anarchy and an absence of conditions which could give you personal safety? Does he discuss that in detail, or simply dismiss it as irrelevant?
I think that's where he has, I mean, some people would call it a depressing view or despairing view. Other people think a despairing view just because he seems to valorize death. Other people would say, it's not a despairing view because it's backed by the ultimate confidence that death is just one stage before you achieve moksha, or you achieve salvation. So the way I'm answering this question is that, for thinkers like Hobbes, anarchy is the end of the road. Death is the end of the road.
Right.
I don't think it is for Gandhi. I don't, and I don't know what he sees beyond death, but he talks as though he sees something beyond death.
And he's also saying that the state does not have to do this. We as human beings can negotiate our way out of anarchy and way out of radical insecurity.
Yes.
Some may have to die, and some may be willing to sacrifice themselves, but this is not the job of the state. This is the job of us human beings.
Yes. That's
to secure ourselves, right?
Yes. That's the kind of security Gandhi most cares about.
Right.
Okay. And that's the kind of security the state cannot give you. It cannot give you self-understanding and or self-realization. The only conception of self-realization that the state could have is things like not having you humiliated, or even more prosaically, making you feel equal, giving you equal rights, getting rid of these distinctions between Brahmins and untouchables. So it can do that, but it can't give you more than that.
Right. Well, it's 2:00, just past 2:00. We have to bring this session to a close. On behalf of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, Brown University, let me thank Uday very profoundly, very deeply for two remarkably thought-provoking lectures. Thank you, Karuna and thank you, Juliet, for your commentary. And the questions and comments that have come in the chat room, we will, I think, preserve them or save them. That was the right word, save them, and send them to the three of you, just in case you have more to say on those matters. So thank you, Uday. Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Juliet. And we'll see you before long on some forum or the other.
Thank you. Thank you.